The Holy Gospel according to John, the 6th chapter. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Well, have you? During these weeks of July, we've been trying to provide this opportunity or this space where we can all ask ourselves the question, how can we or how do we make space for God? In our very busy lives and in this very busy world, how can we separate ourselves from our stuff? How can we separate ourselves from our worldly goals? Or separate ourselves from our busy schedules? Or separate ourselves from our fears? And have the chance to open our eyes to see God at work in and around us? So have you thought about it? I mean, these questions, like many that I ask, typically aren't rhetorical questions. I want to hear how you are doing all these things. Seriously. I want to know, both for the sake of my own understanding and for the sake of this kingdom that we're working so hard to bring forth. And I really think this question about making space is an important question, especially for us today as we wrestle with all these hotly debated topics, as we're bombarded with yet another round of political battles, and as we try to wrap our heads around all the violence in this world. I mean, just this past Friday, this article came out that said in the 204 days that we've had this year, there have been 204 mass shootings. 204 events where 4 or more people have been shot, which include, of course, the ones we hear so much about, Charleston, Chattanooga, Lafayette, but also another 201 places that have gone unmentioned or forgotten. I mean, how do we even start to stand up to these things and have healthy and open conversations about all of this if we can't articulate where God is in the midst of it? How can we begin to see God if we haven't made the space to see God working in the world and in our lives? So my hope these past few weeks would be that it would give us an opportunity to point out that stuff that gets in our way of seeing God. I hoped it would remind us that our goals of acquiring wealth and power aren't the ultimate goals in God's kingdom. I hoped these stories would allow us to set our fears aside and find rest and Sabbath despite our busy lives. And I hope it's helped. And as I said before, this isn't a rhetorical question. How have you made space? It's the start of a conversation that I'd like to have here because, I certainly struggle with it, which is also why we gather like this as a community, as a church, so that our stories aren't alone and we can build on one another's story. Because, as I've said, our stories are important. So this week, as we continue to ask this question, I thought there was maybe another story that would help us. A story from a witness to today's gospel. A story that, if he were here with us today, might sound something like this. I have a story to tell you. It's shocking. Unbelievable, actually. But I was there, and it's true. It changed my life. So I hope you'll believe me. For I'm just a boy, a poor boy. People turn away and don't pay me much attention, and I can't blame them. I'm dirty. I have old clothes that are hand-me-downs. I'm always hungry. Some say that they can see that in my eyes. So I'm always watching and looking and hoping I'll find more food for me and for my family. Most people don't notice me, even though I'm always noticing them. And I noticed that Jesus guy. From the moment I saw him, I noticed he was different. He was radical. But he had this sense of peace about him as well. Someone you wanted to be your friend. Someone who knew you could be more than what you already are. Someone who saw me for me and still welcomed me. So I went to where he was. I watched, I listened, I hoped for more of him, I hoped for more of me. And I wasn't the only one. He always had these people following him, always had people who wanted to touch him or have him touch them. People after people after people. Sometimes you couldn't see past the crowds of all those people. There were just too many to count. His disciples, as he called them, they were just ordinary folks like me. But they knew that Jesus was something special, and so they followed him. And even they could heal and teach because they followed. And so I watched, and more people kept coming to see Jesus, to know Jesus. And I just watched. The crowds that day, they were too many to count. I bet there were over 5,000 there. And so was Jesus. And it was getting late, and the crowd seemed hungry, and I overheard Jesus say, "Where are we to buy bread for these people?" Although I could see it in his eyes that he wasn't really asking. Jesus knew that they would be fed. But those disciples who followed him, they just didn't get it. One of them said 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get some. But that's when it happened. Right then, I noticed that they looked right at me. At me. I started shaking. I started holding on tighter to the food that I had found that day because it was the only food I was able to get for my family. 5 loaves and 2 fish was all that I had. And I could hear them as they looked and pointed at me. Well, there's this boy here who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many? Well, I'll tell you, those loaves were my livelihood and the sustenance for my family. It was everything to me. But then Jesus looked at me, and that look told me what I had to do. I couldn't keep all that bread and fish to myself. I had to give all that I had, even though I was afraid that my family might not eat. I had to give all that I had, trusting in that one named Jesus. So I gave it all. What happened next was nothing short of miracle, because he gave thanks, he blessed it, he broke it, and everyone ate as much as they wanted. Everyone ate and was filled. Everyone was satisfied. Everyone. I thought it was over, but then Jesus said, "Gather up the fragments so nothing is lost." And I think you've heard the story, but I just didn't believe it. There were 12 baskets left. 12. From my 5 loaves and 2 fish. All that I had, such measly offerings, turned into an abundance. I mean, this man, Jesus, he changed me. I can't be the same as I was. And it can change you too, but only if you let it. Again, that's just one story that we've heard. It's a story that joins all of our stories of scarcity and abundance to see how God is at work in and through us. I mean, I understand our fear in giving what we have. I understand the fear of looking at that balance in your checkbook. I understand the questions of wondering how we'll make it in the coming months. I understand the concern of who to support since there's so much need around us and only so much we can do. And I know that those questions exist right here in the church too. But I think the question that should be asked instead is, how can God take from our scarcity and turn it into abundance? I mean, what might happen if we give all that we have? If we dare to give outside of ourselves? Or if we trust in God's promise of abundance? I mean, we don't know what that little boy was thinking when he gave all that he had. We don't know how worried he was at giving away all that he had to eat. We don't know the fear he felt, wondering if his family would eat that night. All that we know is that he did give all that he had. It's a little portion of bread and fish, and Jesus took it, blessed it, broke it, and turned it into abundance. You know, God is not found in the midst of our accumulations of stuff or wealth or power. God does not show up more when we add more to our calendars and schedules. No, we can find God in the space. We see God when we rid ourselves of those distractions and those things and ways that we think build us up, but that really don't. And we can see that God can use our scarcity and space to create an abundance of life in us and in this world. I say thanks be to God. Amen.